Good afternoon or good morning for those who might be on the West Coast, and welcome to the second in our series of webinars on the cart before the horse. And this webinar, we're going to take a different approach. We're going to have a demonstration of the cart. We'll walk through an example of a farmer or rancher. I think this is a farmer in this case, pretty sure, interested in applying for the Conservation Stewardship Program, one of the major working lands program in NRCS. And we'll start with a complete assessment and basically how it works. And that's what we're going to be doing today. Again, we're the National Center for Appropriate Technology. We've been around for 44 years, since 1976. We have 5 offices around the country, and we run oops, I went too far. I want to go on back one more. We run a program called ATTRA, Appropriate Technology Transfer for Rural Areas, if you've ever wondered to know. And that's been going for some 30-some years. And it's a program that is funded through the USDA, a cooperative agreement we have with USDA. We've run it for USDA for 30 years. We're actually part of the Farm Bill. We've been around for a long time helping farmers. We answer questions in any form you can get the question to us in these days. We still have a 1-800 number, which is actually used by some folks. We have hundreds of publications, podcasts, and there's webinars, videos of it. We have copies of all our webinars. We have a blog. We're doing all the things we can to reach out to farmers and answer the questions on the general topic of sustainable agriculture. And I also want to welcome the NRCS to this webinar. Without them, we wouldn't be here today. And they've been going since 87 years. Thomas Bennett started the soil, what did they call that? I forgot. Soil bank thing way back in the days of the Dust Bowl. And they've been going on and giving great conservation solutions and resources for folks for many, many years. Glad to have them here. And the speakers today are Aaron and Eric. And you can read their little bios there. Eric's going to be mostly in charge today. He's a natural resource specialist from NRCS. I also found out that he used to work in Illinois. So if there's any Illinois folks there, you might have known he was a district conservationist in Illinois and actually has worked with the CSP program, but he's been engaged also in the cart now in Washington, D.C. So he's going to be, and Aaron's going to be there to answer questions as well. Other matters. A survey will appear at the very end. It'll just come up automatically, and we'd appreciate if you'd fill that. It's not very long. I think it's only 5 or 6 questions. It would really help us if we want to improve our webinars in the future, and tells us a little bit about what you learned. Again, this webinar also builds on the previous one, which was on kind of an introductory one that is now available on our website. So you can go there and you can actually, if you want to go backwards and catch up, to this, and you can, it feeds on that, and the next one that comes in a couple of weeks from now, that will also build on this. So you can learn, continuous learning here if you just keep going back. The other thing I want to point out is that you have a question box, and that is the only way you can get questions to us, is to type them in. And please type them in all along as you're going along. We will be doing some pausing if necessary to answer questions. We'll certainly have a Q&A period at the end. But even if we don't get to answer your question, if you type the question in, it will be documented, and I will get back to you later with answering to your questions if we don't answer it fully in this session. So it's really important that you just, as you get questions, just type them in, and we'll try to respond to as many as we can. And there we are. And let's go back, and now we're going to turn control over to Eric, and he's going to begin the cart demonstrations. Take it away, Eric.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. All right. Let me share my desktop with everybody, and then if I could get a quick confirmation that you can see my screen before I get started.
We can.
Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As Jeff said, my name is Eric McTaggart. I've been working with the agency 19 years now. As you mentioned, I'm born and raised in East Central Illinois. If you are a University of Illinois fan and you know where that university is, there in Champaign, Illinois, I grew up just about 45 minutes due north of the University of Illinois. Growing up on a grain farm, corn and soybeans mostly, with 4 older brothers. 2 of them still farm to this day. So this webinar today is to give you a look at the conservation assessment and ranking tool that we refer to as CART, and with a focus on applying for the conservation stewardship program, one of our largest working lands programs that we have within the agency. Acres surpassing even the CRP Conservation Reserve program here a couple of years ago. So many acres under contract with that program. So there's a good interest in understanding how this new system, CART, will work with promoting and implementing that program, CSP. So as with any of our conservation programs, the very first step that you'll need to do is, contact your local soil water service center, talk to your NRCS staff, make a request for assistance. That request for assistance can be very general. You don't have to have a very focused request. Like for this example, we're interested in the conservation stewardship program example. So if you were truly knew that day one walking into the field office, with our programs, we have an application form that you can fill out. So here on the screen, I'm showing you our application form for CSP. So there's some general things to just be aware of if you're going to enroll in CSP. We do require you to have FSA farm records. You need to enroll all the land that you will have control of for 5 years. So that's the length of the CSP contract. So the local field office will work through you on identifying which of your property you do have control of for 5 years. If you happen to lose some ground over the life of the contract, there's plenty of ways that we work through contract management to remove those acres. But ideally, we want to enroll the land that you will have control of for the length of the contract. Another key thing to be aware of is when you enroll is how you operate your land is how you will be signing up. So if you farm as an individual, like my brothers do, they would sign up as an individual. If you happen to have an entity or joint operation that the farming or ranching operation falls under, that would be the applicant for CSP. So this is the very simple form, kind of walks through some general questions, what kind of crop production you have, livestock, whether the land is private, public, or tribal. Sometimes there's implications with parts of our conservation programs where we need to know that kind of information. What type of control you have for the land, whether that's deed, you own it yourself, or if there's some kind of lease or other agreement that you have. And then question 7 is very general. We just want to make sure that if there's any other conservation programs on your land that we don't provide duplicative payment to you. So we are very conscious of our taxpayers' money, so we do that. And then if you fall into any of these categories, limited resource, beginning farmer, et cetera, your local field office will walk you through that as well. And there's definitions to help you understand what those all mean as you're filling out the application. And then we're also are interested in organic certification or whether you're transitioning. And then finally, we'll give you a copy of what we refer to as the contractual appendix. And then you'll be asked to sign the application. Now, the key thing to know with applications they're not legally binding. It's just a request for consideration for this conservation program. The appendix that you will be given is just the contractual language that will accompany the contract if you were to receive one. So we give those to you at the time of application so you can read it over and understand your legal obligations if we were to get to a contract. One thing to note is I'll be going through this entire process at any time during that process, you can file an application. You don't have to do it at the beginning. We're always trying to be as flexible and easygoing with our clientele. So if you don't feel comfortable filling out an application at the beginning, you can wait to fill one out at any time. All right. So the first software that you'll see in front of you here is the Conservation Desktop. This is the piece of software that was recently rolled out this fiscal year to our field offices. We were previously using a different software referred to as Toolkit previously. But what this allows us to do is geospatially tie your conservation practices, resource concerns to the landscape in this database. And this is where we will build out your conservation plan. So the first step with working with the client is we locate that land that you have control of for 5 years, and we start to build out a practice schedule, as we refer to it as. So we build out all the land units. So here we see some yellow land units. These are the ones for our example that I have found. So we have a mixture of cropland, rangeland, and one farmstead, which will encompass our farming operation that we will evaluate for the purposes of CSP. After we have the land digitized, that is as far as we have to go in Conservation Desktop. And then we move over to our assessment program referred to as CART, which again stands for the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool. So the user will click on Assessment, and then it'll bring us over to the Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool. So the information that is provided from Conservation Desktop, we have all the land units here on the left, denoted by Farm Service Agency, track, and land units. I should also note that this information is all PI, personal identifiable information has been removed. We're just working under a demo folder provided to us from the state of Kansas. Also, along with that geospatial information that we pulled over into the assessment, we have pulled information in regards to climate data, soils information, and it's going to help bring that information to the forefront to our planners so they can evaluate the landscape. Now, we have built CART to be program neutral. So in this example, we're going to be looking at CSP, and with CSP comes some program requirements for the level of evaluation that needs to be done. But this tool is configurable for the needs of our clients. So we can look at a small subset of resource concerns, or we can also look at as many as necessary for meet the needs of the clients, or like in this example, meet the program requirements. Here you can see that next to the land units, we have their land uses. These were geospatially tied in Conservation Desktop, a previous software. So this is their existing condition, but if we are working with a client and they want to adjust their land use for a planned condition, we can make that adjustment in CART. We can make adjustments to what the future condition will be. So perhaps they would like to adjust this and move it to pasture. We can, or additional rangeland, we can make that adjustment here within the software and go from what the existing condition is to a planned condition. Also to note, we have what we refer to as land use modifiers. This gives us additional information up and above that land use. So if the cropland would happen to be irrigated, we can make that designation, which will impact the outcomes for some resource concern evaluation when it comes to soil erosion, for instance. Or perhaps there's a stream running alongside or through the land unit, we could add a water feature denoting that there is surface water on this land unit, as well as the other choices that could be selected. All of this is going into the inventory and evaluation of the land unit. And I'll pause there for a second. Jeff, is there any questions currently?
I think, no, there isn't at this point. Oh, we're good.
Oh, okay. So as I mentioned, the tool CART is built for program neutral planning. CSP does require some program requirements for the level of conservation review that we need to do based on resource concern categories. So if you were to work with your local field office, they would be referencing this piece of guidance that I'm showing now with these two tables. So from national headquarters, we provide a list of resource concern categories that need to be evaluated for each land use that may be a part of your operation. So on the left-hand side, we can see that we have the land uses, cropland, pasture range. The NIPF is non-industrial private forest land, farmstead, and AAL stands for associated ag land. So that incidental land along our cropland pasture range. And then across the top, we have our categories for resource concerns. So for our example here, the field office would be noting that we're discussing cropland, range, and farmstead, and then they would use where there's an X, they would know that they need to evaluate that resource concern for the purposes of CSP. So as we work through the process, we have built the tool to be intuitive to work from left to right. So here we need to associate the resource concerns to the appropriate land units. I should also note that you can see all these steps have been marked complete to ensure that the live demo had the highest level of success, and to be able to get through this in a timely manner, I have gone through the workflow. So if I hadn't, a lot of these steps would show not started or in progress, and that is to help aid our users to know where they need to continue to work and where they have completed their work. So we'll navigate to the resource concerns page. On the left-hand side, you'll see the resource concern categories, which match up to those two tables that I previously showed. If we're to open up a resource concern like concentrated erosion, then we have what we refer to as the individual resource concerns that fall underneath the category. So for concentrated erosion, for example, we have bank erosion from streams and shorelines, and then we have classic gully and ephemeral gully erosion. And if you're curious where sheet and rill and wind erosion falls, there's another category referred to as wind and water erosion. So we have sheet and rill erosion and wind erosion. And as we scroll through, we can see that there's, for the purposes of livestock, for terrestrial habitat, land management, fire management, pesticide loss, we have multiple categories with the resource concerns that fall underneath. On the right-hand side, we'll have our land units. So as a field office employee, as I am today in this demonstration, they have the option to look at your land units by track, or more preferably, they can look at this by land use. Since if you remembered that chart previously was sorted by land use, they can quickly reference that chart and then associate appropriate resource concerns. So it's as simple as they want to look at concentrated erosion, they can pick ephemeral gully erosion and associate it to the appropriate land use. So ephemeral gully is only appropriate for the cropland use, so they would denote that they need to evaluate ephemeral gully on all these cropland land units. It's not designating that there is a resource concern out there. It's just merely saying, as part of the assessment, I will be looking at ephemeral gully erosion on all of these land units. So same thing for classic gully erosion. Now, classic gully erosion can happen and is applicable on crop range and farmstead. So for this example, I have already associated it to every land unit in the operation. So I used that table, correlated it with the resource concern categories and resource concerns that fall underneath it. And I've worked through the workflow. And at the bottom, CART begins to build out a reference table for the user to ensure that they have associated all the appropriate resource concerns. So we can see the land units, and then on the as we work our way across, we can see all the resource concerns. So you can see there is a fair amount of resource concerns that must be evaluated for the purposes of CSP due to that level of requirement from the program itself. So we'll save our resource concerns, and then we will move on to the next step. as we're navigating back to the assessment summary page, this would be a great time if there is any questions at this time.
Yeah, there's one. And
Sure.
yeah, Eric, there's one. And maybe I'll try to edit it a bit, but you went through those completed things that you weren't going to do because that would have been. Is that that's all part of the assessment? And I guess what the person asking is the farmer kind of actively engaged? I mean, are they sitting right by there, making sure that the assessment is done correctly, or is that just done by the conservationist on their own? I get the sense that they wanted to know, did they engage in completing that assessment?
Yeah, that is a great question. That was the point I wanted to make. So I do appreciate the question being asked. So, so this process with selecting the resource concerns, if we were merely working with a client that walked in with a request, we would have a discussion with them on what their need is, and we would select the appropriate resource concerns based on that conversation. And then also we would do a field visit. So we could work with the client out in the field. If we noticed additional resource concerns, we could bring them to their attention. We could evaluate those as well as necessary. As we work through this process, you'll see the next step is the resource inventory and questions, and I'll click on that. And again, we're going to work with the client to understand their operation through an interview process, to go into the field, to meeting them out in the field as necessary, so we can have a clear understanding of what their operation is, how they manage things like nutrient management, pesticide management, their tillage operation, what crops they're growing, et cetera. So it's not all done from the desk. The best way to do conservation planning is through a lot of communication, open communication with our clients.
And I have another one, and I'm not sure, it might be back on another previous slide, but one person says, why was energy only checked on one land use in the last example? I don't know if you noticed that or not.
Sure. Yeah, we can take a look at that. So for programmatic requirements, let's see if I have that. And maybe I selected wrong. It's possible. Let's see. Inefficient energy use. Here we go. So for the program requirement, for this example, it's only required on the farmstead. So for this demonstration purpose, that is why I only chose it for the one land unit, because there's only one land unit for farmstead. Now, if a client has additional need to evaluate inefficient energy use on the cropland, we can surely do that as well, or any other land use that is applicable. Good question. Excellent question.
I think that's it for now. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. So now we'll work through the resource inventory. So this is where we have our resource assessment questions to evaluate the resource concerns that we had previously selected. One thing to note with CART that is different from previous tools is that we have built CART to be configurable, meaning that for the field user, they will only see the relevant questions based on the land uses in the assessment. So I'm tied to those land units as we saw before, any modifiers that are tied to it, as well as the resource concerns that they have selected. So if there are irrelevant questions, those will be hidden from the user, saving them time so that they can focus on those ones that are most important, are actually relevant to your situation, so they can be filled out. So again, it shows completed because I've worked through the process. Otherwise, they would show a status of not started. Some would show a progress of in progress, and that is because we have answered geospatially some of the information for them, and I'll show you that here in a second. So we have 4 survey types. Here we have land use, and as we work through, there's subsections into land use survey type, and this is the largest set of questions falling under land use. So we can see we have some questions here. Climate factor, it's going to be geospatially by a web service answered by location, and we refer to that as a software answer. Again, I'm going to sort our land units by land use. It sometimes aids in answering the questions. So since it's software answered, we can select the question and see the answers on the right that have been provided. So here we can see the climate factor is humid, but we cannot change that outcome. And then when we deal with the cover crop and residue, this is a answered question by the user. So here, if we select moderate, that was the answer that I gave. It is tied to all the cropland land units. We also have built the tool to be configurable to show the user when a question is not relevant for other land units. So here we can see range and farmstead. We are not, that question and answer is not applicable to their land uses. Now, if you remember, I showed you classic gully. It was applicable to all the land units, so we've had to provide an answer to all the land units. I've said there's an active gully erosion on 2 of our cropland fields, so there's a resource concern that we would need to address. So through maybe a discussion with the client or through field observation, we have seen that there is an active gully erosion. For all the others, I've noted that there's no active gully erosion on the property. So what that would do is show that we do not have a resource concern that we need to address. Ephemeral gully erosion, again, only applicable to the crop, as I previously mentioned, therefore it's not listed as applicable or needing to be answered for range and farmstead land units. And then we just kind of work our way through the other questions: plant structure and composition, risk and hazard for wildlife. This one is applicable to our rangeland, so I've said that there is the potential for wildlife hazard for biomass accumulation, but the site resources are not at risk. So you just work through this. Again, it'll be through conversations with the client, going to the field, making observations. So this is a process that will probably take some of the longest time for our field users in conversation with the client to work through. And I see we're about halfway through our webinar, so I'm going to kind of pick up the pace a little bit on this page just to save us some time for some additional things. So then we walk through livestock. We ask what kind of livestock is, if it's present on the land unit, yes or no. So for this example, I said that for the cropland there was no livestock, but for range and farmstead there was. And then we go through primary species. So then we get to pick what kind of livestock we have out on the operation. This one is multiple answers. So if you have multiple types of livestock on a given land unit, you can make note of that as well. And then we're just curious about their animal numbers. This is not animal units, just the number of animals that are on the land. Feed and forage for it, whether there's an adequate amount. Do we have adequate livestock shelter, adequate livestock water? All these carry questions that we can answer to evaluate the resource concerns. Then we'll want to know what kind of cropping system we have out on the landscape. So we know we're in a humid climate, so the software asks us what kind of crop we're growing for the humid climate. So for this example, I said we had, I believe it's close growing crops on some of the land units. And then I also said we had some durable row crops with the residue that's not harvested. And I'll show you, I broke those apart because as we get to for the purposes of CSP, we can categorize our land units, our land uses by groups. Again, we want to know how well the productivity, the plant health is, and plant structure and composition, each carrying a set of questions, a rating system for our evaluation purposes. Same goes for grassland. So when we get to the range, we're going to want to know what kind of range group we're in. So it makes sense that this question is only applicable to range. So I said we had some natural grasslands out there, but you can see depending, you have choices to make other designations as well. And then for the interest of time, so we worked through all that. Then we asked some management questions. Irrigation system, we had a couple land units I should have pointed out previously that had irrigation. So those were land units 1 and 4. So we've answered those questions accordingly. Since the modifier irrigation wasn't tied to any other of the cropland land units, the tool shows that that question therefore is not applicable, since we have not denoted that any other land units besides land unit 1s and 4 were irrigated. Yeah. And then we asked some questions about integrated pest management, and then storage and handling of manure and biosolids. Again, since we have the farmstead, we needed to say what kind of storage we had on there and how it was contained. So we said liquid and solid manure is stored and contained. Now we move on to infrastructure. These questions start to get, you can see how land use was kind of the long one to work through. Equipment and facility. We take questions on what type of buildings we have: dairy, swine, poultry, other, greenhouse. This question is optional, so we'll say we have an other. And then resource concern categories for inefficient energy use. And then we have a rating system of low, moderate, high, severe, and extreme. We said we have a very low risk on our farmstead for the inefficient energy use. And then we get to concentrated pollutants. So we want to know how you handle and store petroleum, your agricultural products on your farmstead. So we can work through that information. Since it's only applicable to the farmstead, we can see again the tool shows that it's not applicable to crop or range. So after we've worked our way through all of these questions and we have field verified them, worked with the client, we have, we'll mark all these complete. We will save our answers, and then we will move on to the next step, which is to designate what kind of existing practices are out on the landscape. So I'll navigate back to the assessment summary page as that's happening. Did we have any additional questions come in?
I think this is an easy one. That somebody says, I have a 1,500 acre farm. This looks like it will take a long time. How long will it take, and will I get a kind of a final report when it's all done?
Sure. So the 1,500, so we tried to build in as many efficiencies in as possible. I should have shown, you know, we've tried to make it for the user where they don't have to answer each question individually. They can pick one answer. If it's representative for multiple fields that fall underneath one track, they can select the track number and it'll associate that with all the land units. So it will take some time depending on the size of the operation. However, from my past experience, even small operations with a lot of details will take just as long as a large operation that may have more commonalities across the large amount of acres. From past experience of being in the field office, the Conservation Stewardship Program has always had a time workload associated with it, just because of the level of assessment or an evaluation that the program requires. At the end, you will be able to get a report that's called the CSP Summary Report. I will show you that here in a little bit, as well as we're building out additional reporting capabilities in CART to provide to the land owner and operator so they can see the evaluation that CART has provided.
That's it for now.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. So we've moved on to the existing practices page. So the nice thing about CART is that geospatial information from Conservation Desktop, if we have worked with you historically, we have records of that work that we've saved in our national database. So you can see under existing practices, we have historical. So that would be the information that we are aware of, that we have a database record of. And that information will be pulled forward for the user so they can take credit for your good work that you've done in the past. Now, we know we haven't worked with everybody, and we know that we don't have a record of all the good work that all our clients do out on the landscape on their own, or maybe they work through another partner agency or a state agency or their local soil and water district. So we also have the capability for our field offices to put in observed practices. So perhaps we don't have that historical record. Through the interview process with the client or through field observations, they realize that there are some additional conservation practices that the client is doing. They can quickly add those to the land unit. So to do that, it's as simple as clicking Add Practice, and then they get to choose the conservation practice that they have. They have some choices that they can break it down by practice type. For our purposes, we're going to look at conservation practice. So perhaps while we are out there, we see a grassed waterway, and we can make note of it and add it to the land unit. A couple things to note on this page is that you'll see this column functional. So we wanted to provide the ability for users, especially when we look at historical information, that we may have had a practice installed years ago that may not be existing on the landscape any longer, or perhaps in the case of the grass waterway I added, maybe we observed the grass waterway out there. However, it's met its life expectancy, it's silted in, now that the water is actually running alongside the grass waterway. So if that's the case, the field user could uncheck the functionality of the conservation practice, and they can make a note to have a record, so when they want to work with the client, then they can go back and possibly replan that grass waterway to be reinstalled. Now, what this does when they uncheck the functionality is all conservation practices in CART carry a numerical value, and that numerical value is pointed towards, there's multiple numerical values for conservation practices, and all those are pointed towards those resource concerns that we are evaluating, because each resource concern carries a threshold that we are trying to achieve to show that the resource concern has been met. So we wouldn't want a conservation practice that is no longer functioning to have those points credited towards meeting a resource concern. So through this process, we had some good information. We have conservation crop rotation that we've taken credit for. Here we can see on the range that they've done some brush management. There's a pond that was installed. They've done prescribed grazing. All this is historical information before, when we had people working in the field office. Unless you had a good history with that client and you knew their operation, or you had previously installed it yourself through other programs, you would have a hard time determining if this had taken place. So this is bringing it to the forefront for our planners, so all that good work that you've done can be credited. So we'll just quickly flip through. We've done some observe on all the cropland. We've said there's reduced tillage. And then we can get down to the range. Again, we have brush management. They've done some upland wildlife habitat. Farmstead, we don't have any observed practices listed, and that's fine. You don't have to have observed practices. But after you get done, again, working with the client, going to the field, we'll just mark them all complete. And now, through the process of looking at those resource inventory questions and through the existing practices, we have determined your as-is condition. So at the time of application, we want to know how well of a steward you are to the land. This evaluation will set that benchmark, and we'll show that here in a little bit. Any questions come into the queue? I know that was a little quick, but I know we're short on.
Yeah. How is energy use evaluated or assessed?
So energy use is evaluated. We have a tool outside of CART that is ran to provide that high, medium, and low level answer. In the future, we're going to build in detailed assessments into the CART system itself. so that there won't be an outside tool. It'll all be integrated into this one piece of software, which is our ultimate goal, is to keep our field users into one pane of glass where they work and not have to jump out and create duplicative information. Great question.
That's it for now.
Excellent. Excellent. So now we move on to plan practices. So we've worked with the client. We want to see what kind of additional conservation practices, or in regards to CSP, what types of enhancements they wish to do. So through the planning process, we'll work with them, and we can select a land unit. We can, again, we click the add practices, pulls up the same window of opportunity to add practices, just like we saw previously. We simply type in what we want to do, and it'll begin to pull it up, and we can select it for funding. I won't add an additional one, so to save time, but some things to note on the plan practice page. So there's primary and supporting. So a primary conservation practice is one that will be the primary conservation practice to address the resource concern, and then supporting practices are just that. They support other conservation practices, or in this case, our existing activity payments that come with CSP. They're just an avenue for us to provide the financial assistance as required through CSP. They don't really address the resource concern, so we'll leave those as supporting as well. Another addition is the seek funding column. Right now we can see we're seeking funding, so that financial assistance for all three of these conservation practices. However, with this column, if we were to plan a practice that the landowner wanted to do on their own, so perhaps that grass waterway, they just decided they wish to do it on their own, we can say it's a primary, but maybe we're not going to seek funding because it's just a conservation practice we're going to plan with the client, and they wish to just do the work on their own. What that does is it'll show in the evaluation of the resource concerns and them being addressed. However, when we get to the ranking portion and seek funding, the grass waterway will not seek any kind of financial assistance for installation. I'll just real quick delete this out. And there we go. All right. So another thing that we do with this tool, again, the person asked about the 1,500 acres. You can, this would be an example of an efficiency we built into the tool. So here we've planned one conservation practice across all these land units. So if we highlight all the land units, it'll show the conservation practice that we have in common. If we wanted to add another conservation practice to all these land units, we can do that real quickly by highlighting as many land units as we wish and add a practice, and then that practice will be added to all those land units at one time. So with large operations, that should help as well. Here's a good example of the primary and supporting. So here we have a grass waterway. We said we had a gully erosion on this land unit, so we wanted to plan a grass waterway to address it. So that's the primary. And then the subsurface drainage is going to support the grass waterway and maintain a drier soil so the grass can maintain health and vigor and protect the soil from additional erosion in that channel. So through this process, we would work with the client. We would plan conservation practices or enhancements. Here we have a cover crop that we planned, and that is associated with all these land units here. Let's turn that one off. And then we can see that for all the cropland, we have cover crops planned. So again, working with the client, what their objectives are, looking at their economics, their field equipment, their operation, what they can handle, what they want to do. We will plan out the appropriate conservation practices to enhance that stewardship level. And now we have completed the entire evaluation process. So again, we'll have a momentary pause while we navigate back to the assessment summary. So, any questions that popped up?
Yeah, and I think this might be we might be getting to this further on, but how
Sure.
does making a marking practice as primary supporting affect the applicant's ranking score for CSP?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So in regards to marking and primary is supporting, so the primary practices carry practice points, and those will carry over as well as the supporting practices. Now, for the purposes of the evaluation, the assessment, not ranking is what I'm trying to say, only the primary points will count towards the evaluation. All
Okay.
right, so I failed. Yep. I failed to save my work, so I had to go back and save my work. So my apologies for the momentary pause. All right. So real quick, another thing to note is, so when we developed CART, we realized that we could not create a tool that would be absolutely perfect for every situation across the entire United States, as well as we know that we have highly trained technical experts in the field, and we wanted to provide them with the ability to disagree with the tool. So here on the results page, we can see the culmination of all our hard work across all the land units. And then on this page, we have provided the field users the ability to disagree with CART, and we refer to that as an override. So as it navigates over, so when we get to the results page, we can see we start with a plan roll-up. So this is all the land units, which encompasses all those different land uses rolled up into one, and an overall view and score of those resource concerns that we have evaluated. So here, looking at concentrated erosion, that was our category. We looked at classic gully erosion and ephemeral gully. Classic gully was across all the land use types. Ephemeral, if you remember, was only on the cropland. Each of these carry a threshold of 50. So that is that criteria that we are striving for to show that the resource concern does not exist on landscape. These orange triangles are to aid the user. If they hover over them, it will show the user which land units are those land units that fell below their individual thresholds, and then when rolled up, kept the value of the condition below the threshold. So let's go take a look at a couple of those individual land units to show you what I mean, and then where the overrides can take place. All right. Another thing to note is that we have not only the numerical table view, but we also have a graph view, which makes it much easier for our users and our clients to take a quick evaluation of the condition. So this is where the override takes place. So here we can see for wind erosion, the value in this column is that existing condition. So the 30 points from our questions and answers that we gave, the 30 points from existing practices gave us a value of 60. We were striving based on these dynamic conditions by the land for a value of 80. So we fell short. The field user can override the existing total. They can make a note. So I said the geospatial data does not represent field conditions, and my field observation was cover adequate to prevent wind erosion. Another option would be I could have ran perhaps a separate tool if I was new to the agency and wanted to verify the CART outcome and make a judgment call based on that as well. So that has moved this not met condition, since it was below 80, was not met, to a met condition. So we're running short on time, so I apologize. So that's a real brief overview on the results. Once you get to this point, you will create a CSP Summary Report, and I'll show you that. So the program requires that a CSP Summary Report, let me shrink this down some, be developed. And what this is looking at is on the left-hand side here, we're looking at our crops. So we got our close growing crops, our row crops. It's grouped those together, gave us the total acres, and then also gave us the results for each in these two columns here. On the left-hand side, we'll see those resource concern categories required by program policy to be evaluated. And then there's a column here for the state priority resource concerns. So each individual state gets to set their state priority resource concerns, and then those are used for that purposes of the existing activity payment, and as well, it can be used for ranking purposes as well. So I want to definitely get to the ranking aspect. So we're going to mark our assessment ready for ranking, and this will lock our assessment. And when it does that, it's going to recalculate all the geospatial information one last time to make sure nothing has changed in Conservation Desktop that would need to be reflected in our assessment. Any questions in the queue, Jeff?
No, not really. And I think, and don't worry, we can go a little bit over. It seems like everybody's hanging in there. We still have over 150 attendees, so I think
Okay.
we don't have to close her down if we run a little short, so we can get some questions.
All right. Absolutely. That sounds great. I appreciate you letting me know. All right. So after this would complete our evaluation process. So we've walked through the process of selecting our land units so that we have control for 5 years. We selected the appropriate resource concerns. We've evaluated them based on the existing condition, which comes from those resource inventory questions, our existing practices, and then we've also planned a planned practice condition. So now the next step we'll go to is ranking. The nice thing about that is that we're all housed into one system here in CART. So we quickly move into the ranking of the conservation programs. So one thing I mentioned is that this tool was built to be program neutral. So we will see not only the conservation stewardship program ranking pools, but also we will see the other associated Farm Bill programs like EQIP that can provide financial assistance for some of those conservation practices like the grass waterway that we planned to address the resource concern of a classic gully. And we are doing a live demo, so hopefully this step will work well. So we can start to see in the background some of the what we refer to as non-geospatial determined ranking pools. So we have tried to build in, like previously mentioned, all the possible efficiencies for our field users as we can. And one of those capabilities is, and hopefully it will load, down below we have the geospatial applicable ranking pools. So based on the geospatial location of those land units that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, the state can set up ranking pools to recognize their location and then offer financial assistance programs based on their location. So perhaps there's a watershed program in Kansas for where those land units were located. Those ranking pools will then become applicable. Also, what's happening besides the geospatial processing is based on the assessment that has been done, each ranking pool is evaluating whether those land uses, so for us that was crop, range, and farmstead, so are those applicable to this ranking pool? Are the resource concerns we selected, are they applicable to the ranking pool? And also finally, those conservation practices. So for my time in the field and bringing on new employees into my office, the difficulty was those new employees had a hard time learning quickly all the available funding sources that client could apply to so they could get financial assistance to implement those conservation practices. In the past, we had paper maps, paper charts, matrices that we would try to help provide that guidance to those new employees, or even, you know, for us veterans, if a new program came out and we missed it, we wouldn't be aware. So now the software brings it to the attention of our field users so we can provide all the possible funding sources to our client. So this step just shows us that we have both non-geospatial determined ranking pools that are available and the geospatial. And this is really to help our field offices realize that everything was successfully returned. On one of these pages, we can see geospatial applicability not met. So we have a geospatial layer that's having an issue we need to go correct. so we can make that determination of whether or not we should be seeking funding and potentially in that pool. So we'll continue on to ranking and all these ranking pools, and we'll rank out one ranking pool for CSP. All right. So here we can see we have actually, I should also mention I'm working in what is referred to as the training environment of CART. So Kansas has built out a lot of ranking pools for the purposes of practicing and building those ranking pools, as well as giving training to their staff in Kansas. So there is actually 3 pages of potential funding sources for the conservation practices and this client to help implement those. So we'll pick one of these. Here we have the Kansas CSP Ag Land General 3. We can see that we have 13 land units that were a part of our assessment. So for this one, we have 13 that are applicable. Here, if we look up at Kansas, their beginning farmer, now this is EQIP, but you can see that this information was brought forth to me, the field user. So 2 of those land units are applicable to this funding source. So there's another avenue potentially for funding. If CSP wasn't to come through, perhaps I could get some funding for a few of their conservation practices on those 2 land units. So that's the beauty of this program. It helps our field staff understand what is applicable to provide funding. So we're going to go real quick. We're going to go answer some survey questions. So those are our ranking questions. And one thing I should have noticed that we actually have already pulled some numerical ranking value, and that's coming over from the assessment. So that's looking at those planned practices and their values that they provide, those numerical values, and then also vulnerability. We may get a chance to speak to that, but we're harnessing the information from the assessment as the key to start to build the ranking, where in the past we had our field offices doing duplicative work. So now we've streamlined that as well. So the first applicability question, since it's text, is this a CSP Classic Area 3 Fund Pool application? So this is a text question, so it has to be answered yes. This is going to show that we're applicable. The state could have built that geospatially to be answered. So the administrative area of Area 3 has a boundary. If those land units were within that geospatial boundary, the software would have answered it for them, but state of Kansas has built this for training purposes as a text question. More than likely, they have this as a software answered geospatial question. Then we'll walk through this. I've been through this before. This question is going to ask us to select a fund pool. It's just going to be Area 3. So again, we're in the training environment. They just wanted to be able to work through the workflow. We do require a question for each one of these steps. So they probably just did this to appease the software system. Now we get to program questions and resource questions. This is important to note that these questions that you will see in here can be influenced and impacted by the state technical committees in your states, and your local work groups can have feedback in these as well. This is where that local input gets folded into the ranking process, and then it helps to steer the financial assistance to those areas of local need or the technical committee's focus. So we'll just real quick, as some questions, we'll walk through these pretty quick. Does the application have CRP transitioning? We're going to say not applicable. When are the conservation activities planned in the contract offer on all land uses? We'll just say in the next 3 months, or 36 months. And does the application include an enhancement bundle? We did not plan an enhancement bundle. And then finally, there's another set of questions. So the field user may or may not need to work with the client to answer this. They should be pulling a lot of this information from the assessment and the landscape. And I'm just going to real quick. So each one of these questions and the answers provides numerical value for ranking. So we're just going to real quick, since we've reached our 1 hour mark, we will just select an answer real quick. Each one of these will be different for all ranking pools. So depending on how your state has configured or set up the ranking pools, there will be a unique set of questions for you or for the field office to answer on your behalf. for the conservation program. All right. So then we've answered all the questions successfully, and then we will move back to the applicable ranking pools. We'll see now that we went from a status of draft, meaning we hadn't started yet, to in progress. Once we have it completed, we will mark it complete, which will allow us to then link your application number. So the application that we talked about before carries a numerical value. We currently don't have one for this example, but it would show up here once it's in our contracting software, and we will be able to link it to this assessment and this ranking pool. And then we can also add an estimated cost for the value of the total contract, and we can add that in as well. So as you can see, we have a final score since we're completed of 32 points. If we look at below, all these are still in draft, so I can kind of go back to what I wish I would have mentioned earlier. You can see that there's already ranking scores that have been provided, and that's information that's coming from the assessment. And then lastly, before I turn it back over to Jeff, is we can look at what we refer to as the applicability details, and as a client, you can get a copy of this information. And what this does is show your assessment. We're showing what ranking pool we're working in. So here we are in the CSP Ag Land General Area 3. 13 of the 13 land units were applicable. Our total ranking score, cost estimate, and we have a completed status. And then we show which land units were included. Sometimes, if not all the land units are included, we'll show which ones are excluded. And then we'll show what the practices are that will be seeking funding underneath this ranking pool. And then we'll show all the resource concerns we evaluated. And then here are the answers to our questions that we just walked through for the ranking. Here we can see the numerical point values that came along with each one of those answers that we provided to those. Here we are to the resource priority questions, and then the program priority questions. So when we get done, Aaron mentioned this in the first webinar last week, we have vulnerability. So that's the existing condition value and the difference to the threshold. Plan practices, so those points that are carried from the plan practices, and then the points that came from those questions that we answered. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Jeff. My apologies for going over. And then I'll answer any questions that may be out there.
Yeah, that's fine. I got to move this down to a sec. Is the CSP ranking template built into CART, or is it a separate operation after you've finished with CART? We were told earlier that it was a separate, but it sounds like Eric is saying it might all be built in, and hence, when you are done with CART, you are done and ranked. Does that make sense to you?
So that does make sense to me. So there's what we refer to as templates, and those templates come from national headquarters. So CSP carries a national template, and what we do at headquarters is we kind of set the parameters that the states have to work from, and that is all built in CART. And then from that template, the states build their individual ranking pools, as you just seen, based on that template. Again, all housed in CART. So once you get through the assessment and the ranking process, you are fully ranked for the financial assistance and then a demo for CSP.
Next one is each state NRCS office is allowed to choose at least 5 priority resources of concern for the CSP program. Are these priorities embedded in the CART? And if so, is it likely that an applicant that does not address at least one or more of these priorities is likely to be ranked lower than applicants that do address those priorities?
So the state chosen priority resource concerns, we don't have the configurability in the software yet for them to load that individually into CART. It's actually a user input where on that summary sheet I very quickly showed, they will check which resource concerns, so that's a user input, are the state priority resource concerns. Now, depending on how the state builds their ranking pools, if they want to give additional resource concern points for if you met 1 or 2 out of 3 of the state priority resource concerns, then yes, they can have influence on the final ranking. It's dependent on how the ranking pool is developed.
Next one, CSP is designed to reward participating farmers and ranchers for existing conservation efforts as well as the adoption of new conservation activities. How does the CART account for the equal weighting of these two types of conservation efforts? In other words, if one farmer applies for CSP and he or she proposes to maintain existing high levels of conservation, plus say undertake some new conservation, will this farmer be equally ranked with another farmer who has only proposed to undertake new conservation efforts?
Sure. So that's an excellent question. So how that works is we try to break it up in the 5 ranking categories. So, looking at the vulnerability of each property, the planned practices that are willing to be done, and then also for those that are, let's just refer to them as current good stewards to the land, so they will come back where they are meeting those priority resource concerns categories more so than another. That is taken into consideration as well. Like I mentioned, depending on how the state builds the ranking pool, they can give focus to those applicants that are meeting more priority resource concern categories than others. So each state will have their methodology of ranking posted. So that would be a place to take a look at it, or I'm sure the local field office could provide some local clarity on that. I'm just trying to speak more at a national level.
Why are the 5 state priority resource concerns not determined by land use and or let's say ecoregion of the state, rather than just one size fits all the 5 for the entire state, regardless of whether ag land or forest land or cropping land range is being used?
Unfortunately, I'm unable to answer that question. I would need to talk to our program policy branch to have a better answer for that. So I apologize. I do not know the answer to that.
Aaron, do you know? You're there, I think, I'm sure. Maybe not.
I suppose he hung up, so he must have had to go to another meeting.
Oh, you had to go to the next meeting. Okay. It says
since actually, I am still here. Sorry, I was hiding. No, it's a good question. We've talked about the ability to be able to vary those by that. This first year that the policy branch chose to do it in one fashion, that is something that we're getting feedback from the technical advisory committees in each state on whether we should change that approach. So I think it's definitely a valid question that we're looking out for future years on how we're going to address that.
Since CART is composed of 5 components, vulnerabilities, plan, practice, the ones that you mentioned, and each state NRC office may choose a percentage weight for each component, can applicants to the CSP in particular state or pooling area have access to the specific percentage weight given to the program priorities component and what weight to each of the other components? So for example, in a given state pool might provide weighting such as vulnerability is 5%, plan practice is 40%, priority is 20. Anyway, those percentages obviously matter into the ultimate ranking. Are they varied by pool? Let's say like Montana has 4 pools, I know. And so are those percentages matched by pooling area? Are they the same for the entire state? And can an applicant know what those percentages are?
Sure. So each ranking pool can carry its own unique percentages if desired. So, and also, like I showed you that final report, we called it the applicability report. So you, as a client, you can get access to that. So at the end, you can see what the weight was for each one, or percentage was for each one of those 5 ranking factors.
And here's a more practical one. Are field off staff making farm visits during the pandemic?
So I know there's been plenty of guidance to keep the rule of thumb as guidance is to keep a distance of the width of the pickup truck between the 2 of you, if necessary, to be out in the field together. I don't know, Aaron, if you have any other. I'm not in the field right now, so I don't know all the guidance going out to the individual field offices.
Right. Eric basically hit the key one, is to try to maintain appropriate social distancing, and our staff will wear masks. Obviously, as the guidance varies around the nation, as different states may be under different guidance related to what kind of outbreaks they have. But our offices are open. We are, making field visits as appropriate, but doing that in a socially distanced fashion.
Cool. This was more of a suggested idea. Since there's like these ranking pools and by regions, there's ranking beginning farmer, socially disadvantaged. A person was interested in the size neutrality. I know the CSP is supposed to be a size neutrality, so your big farm, small farm should be equally eligible, but there's some limitations around that. I think they were suggesting, would there be possible for states to create a pool, let's say for smaller, medium size, maybe for horticulture, specialty crop and would that be possible to kind of implement within this context so that maybe this issue of having access to the program across all sizes of farms would be possible? I know that's more of a speculative question, I'm sure.
Yeah, so this is Aaron again. And so we definitely take size neutrality very seriously, and trying to maintain our ranking pools do that. What we normally do is that within the ranking pool, we're weighting those scores against size and things like that, so that a small size would have the same potential to score as a large one. For certain ones, like the beginning one, obviously we have those as separate call-out pools. We do look again at that taking the input from the state technical committee to help us build those. And so, as there may be other opportunities to break up pools or have different ranking criteria to help us maintain that size neutrality. But sometimes that's a state, or as you said, certain types of industries are going to look different in that state. So we look at, all of that when building those pools. It gets down to be pretty state specific, so it's hard to answer at the national level, but we do review all of them, trying to maintain size neutrality.
I got unmuted. Thank you all today, and thank you for the questions. And get to all of them. Like I say, we'll get back to you and answer all the questions I can that were written in. I want to make sure that you all know about webinar 3 coming, and that'll be a really deep dive into some of the more of the details of this program on this tool. And then I would thank everyone today. We had a good number of folks that hung in there for the entire thing, and I'm trying to forward. There we go. Again, thanks for everyone for attending. And again, a survey will pop up. Please answer that, because it really helps us. And thank you all, and have a good afternoon, everyone, everywhere.